Greetings from the center of Canada and welcome to the Fringe Faithful Collective. My name is Mike Powell and this is article episode number 4, entitled The Problem with Overstating in Acceptance, Qualification, Replacement or Rejection of the term Christian, and the contrasting virtue of holding our spiritual nomenclature lightly. On October 1st, 2007, a close friend and I went to see another one of our good friends' bands play a gig at the Drake Hotel in Toronto. As we were pulling into a parking lot near the venue, both of us happened to see someone that we recognized. So we stopped the car, rolled down the window, and my friend said, "Hey, Hayden." Hayden Desser, a musician from the city who we'd been listening to for years, stopped, peered into the vehicle, and hesitantly articulated, "Do I know you?" He didn't know us, as we were simply fans of his music. The only time he may have seen us was at one of his concerts, but we had no relationship with Hayden, so the fact that our faces were unfamiliar to him wasn't surprising to us at all. We were just happy to see him. It was one of those chance events that was extremely random, yet meaningful, and it brings to mind a couple different but related types of encounters that we have with others who we either know or only think we do. First, there's the situation when we assume we've seen someone we're acquainted with, only to find out after we've said their name that it's not them. One might call this mistaken identity, as a person is confused for who they aren't. Generally, it simply leads to an awkward apology and people go on with their day. Second, and arguably worse than this, are the circumstances when a known individual is mistaken for a stranger. Like when you run into an old friend you haven't seen for a long time, or when you don't expect to see someone in a particular context and their name completely escapes you, which is significantly more uncomfortable or embarrassing if the other person is experiencing no memory deficit whatsoever. In both events, the issue is false recognition. Either our observations lead us to the conclusion that a person is someone who they're not, or there's been some kind of impairment or impediment to our ability to recall or remember someone we once knew. Regardless, each misperception points us to the hazards of both being confused for someone else and of being unrecognized for someone who we are or who we should be. One potentially useful analogy I can think of for this is the common occurrence of misapprehending a person's country of residence. For instance, Canadians are generally confused for Americans, a mistake that is quickly corrected by anyone living north of the border. Because even though it's often difficult to exhaustively formulate what actually makes a person Canadian, defining ourselves by who we're not is considerably easier. This is undoubtedly a worldwide phenomenon, since where we come from and where we live is a central aspect of our identities. And regardless of the relationship we have with our neighbors, be it positive, negative, indifferent, or non-existent, we don't like to be confused for who we're not. We want to be accurately identified by others. Deeper than any national distinctiveness that we might hold to, though, is the way we delineate ourselves culturally and spiritually, because culture and spirituality have the ability to transcend any arbitrarily created borders. That being said, how one defines oneself religiously or irreligiously has the potential to unite a great many people. One example of this would be the largely dated use of the word Catholic, with a lowercase c, which is used to describe the universal or worldwide church. It's a general term that was originally intended to be inclusive of all traditions, expressions, or variants of Christianity, almost akin to the labels we give citizens of this or that country. Correspondingly, just as those who have citizenship in Canada are a vastly diverse grouping of people who may share little more than the common designation of Canadian, it could be said that anyone who trusts the teachings, example, and person of Jesus Christ to possess some kind of life-altering or redemptive potential is Christian. However, as soon as a statement like this is made, similar to what takes place at national border agencies, some have an inherent tendency to want to verify the spiritual citizenship of others and to prove their own. In other words, people typically want to know whether or not someone else belongs, and no one wants to be confused for who they're not claiming to be. On one hand, it's a fair concern. as the moniker Christian means different things to different people. But on the other hand, whenever people take it upon themselves to nationalistically police the borders of what they understand Christianity to be, this inevitably leads to othering, exclusion, and persecution. For instance, because of what someone considers to be real, or based on the core principles that guide their living, a person might say to someone else that they're a Christian, and one could stop there without expanding upon what they mean. But doing so might give someone else the wrong impression. After all, what does Christian even mean in our 21st century context? Is one solely alluding to their morality? Are they referring to a habitual custom of going to church on Sundays? Are they saying something about a political alliance or a cultural heritage? Or could it be something else? Accordingly, one may choose to qualify what they mean by Christian, either through the mentioning of a denominational affiliation or by using words to aid categorization. To this end, until quite recently, the term evangelical was a helpful descriptor of a positive stream of Christianity. However, since it was co-opted over the past number of years by Christian fundamentalists, the compound designation evangelical Christian no longer means what it used to, especially given the present political situation with our American neighbors and he who must not be named. That being said, another option that some have chosen is a substitutionary approach whereby people actively replace the word Christian with a related expression, such as follower of Jesus or something similar. This way, one is able to elude some of the negative connotations associated with a mainstream understanding of Christianity, while purportedly keeping in step with the good that Christ is understood to stand for. Still, if none of these three options are satisfactory, a fourth alternative would be the attempt to evade the process of naming by abandoning any and all Jesus-linked language. For example, using an expression like spiritual but not religious. There are surely advantages and disadvantages to each approach, but what I'd like to suggest, no matter how a person chooses to define themselves in relation to Jesus, is that we shouldn't hold on to our terminology too tightly. Because when we insist on a particular label as being more right or authentic than another, in other words, when we falsely assume a superiority over another so-called believer based solely on nomenclature, then we're missing something foundational to the life of faith. Namely, as someone once wrote, our love should not be just words and talk. It must be true love, which shows itself in action. Or to say the same thing differently, as Juliette Binoche's character said to Major in the 2017 reload of the film Ghost in the Shell.
What we do is what defines us.
Granted, words are important, yet their overuse or overemphasis can also make them functionally meaningless, which is a significant impediment when it comes to communicating quintessential things, no matter what label, if any, we most prefer. As for an unconditional use of the term Christian, the obvious drawback is guilt by association to others who similarly claim the designation, but whose ideological agenda one cannot in good conscience support. As for a qualified use of the term Christian, the risk here is a further splintering of the church or Christianity into even more fragmented and unamicable tribal subgroups. As for a hardline replacement of Christian with a related term such as Christ follower, such an insistence both unintentionally exhibits a subtle arrogance or condescension, as well as lands one back with the name Christian if ever one is asked about what they mean. In other words, if one says, I'm a Christ follower, the foreseeable follow-up question would be, so you're a Christian? And as for the dispensing of Christian terminology altogether, the probability is that one will lose any identifiable connection to Jesus, which is fine if one no longer wants anything to do with Christianity. But if someone still values the biblical story as a narrative that's central to their lives, the resistance to any kind of specificity reflects a disassociation from the person and message of Christ. After all, the term spiritual can mean almost anything and nothing. Myself, as spelled out on the About the Author page and in the Published By box of every post, the second option, in other words a qualified Christian label, makes the most sense for me at this point in time. The way I see myself right now is as an existential semi-deist Christian. However, as commonly attributed to Corrie ten Boom, either truly or apocryphally, I've learned that we must hold everything loosely. It's a designation that's presently workable for me, but it may not be helpful forever. Therefore, as soon as it loses its functionality, I'll let it go, because it's just a phrase that points beyond itself. As Michael Gungor from the Liturgists aptly wrote in one of his recent Twitter posts when trying to situate himself in the Christian landscape, it's an attempt at a turn signal for oncoming traffic. Spiritual classification for me is almost like our use and valuation of money. Like currency, labels can be beneficial and they're sometimes necessary in our dealings with others. However, as soon as they become the main focus of our lives, in other words, when they're used to exclude others, when they become an end as opposed to a means, when they characterize our self-importance, etc., then an overstated acceptance, qualification, replacement, or rejection of the term Christian is tantamount to what Jesus spoke about when he said, "No one can serve two masters. For either they will hate the one and love the other, or they will be devoted to the one and despise the other." All this to say, what's more important, language or how it's used? Terminology or what the words themselves represent? Is it ultimately about how one defines oneself linguistically? Or could it be that it's about how virtues like peace and love are incarnated in one's life? Clearly, these questions are rhetorical. However we express who we are with words to the world, the more crucial issue is how we live it out in the world, especially among those who are nearest and closest to us. Because even though we can do relatively little ourselves to address the pervasive injustices that have been and are still being done under the banner of Christianity, as I initially wrote in the About the Site section, could it be that we're not actually supposed to be the ones to enact widespread social transformation, but instead to simply do our very best to make a difference in the lives of relatively few people, who will hopefully pay it forward to others, thereby nebulously catalyzing something cumulative and truly significant? That sounds good to me. And maybe if there are enough people occupying different spheres of influence who deliberately make it their priority to do the little they can to embody the best aspects of the Judeo-Christian story, the world could become a better place to inhabit. Peace and love, sisters and brothers.